Let's welcome our moms and give them a big hand. Today's message is not precisely a Mother's Day message. It's going to relate to all of us. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the 80s a little bit. The 1980s, right? What a crazy, weird decade for fashion and for hair. But the 80s, there was, back then, people actually had magazine subscriptions. And there was, two magazines of note back in the day. There was Newsweek and Time, U.S. News and World Report. We'll throw that in for a bonus. But Newsweek had an article, a cover story, with a headline that said this: "Where have all the heroes gone?" That's the question that this cover story and this article tried to address. And in the article, check this out, this was written in 1980 to be precise, about 43 years ago. In this article, the writer bemoaned the fact that we were living in a culture of overpaid celebrities, overpaid and overhyped athletes, and that we had caved into a culture of selfishness and not a culture of service, and was asking the question, where has that sense of heroism gone? Where are all the heroes? And what's interesting about that article is if you fast forward where we are right now in 2023, all of that's nothing. That's nothing. What was considered excessive in the 80s is now just mainstream. Right? We've fully given ourselves over to this cult of self-worship, self-focus, self-care. It's who we are. We live in a time and a culture like I think is unprecedented that's crying out for us to focus on yourself. On me. Selfishness lies at the center of our culture, and many times, if we're to be honest, it lies at the center of who we are. It lies at the center of our lives. What does that look like? Well, it's characterized by, I would say, a compulsion to satisfy the three I's. You know the three I's. The three I's are all around us. The three I's are wooing us. The three I's are popping up on our feed. The three I's are on the billboards, on the streams. The three I's are everywhere. What are the three I's of selfishness in our culture? The first I is to increase. Increase your stuff. Increase your possessions. Get more and more and more and more. And what that's led to in our society today, wherever you fall in the economic class system, it's led to an epidemic of what's known as hoarding, where we get things and get things and get things and get things and get things, and we can't give those things away. And these things that we've increased, we thought would bring us happiness, is now preventing us from actually moving and living. That's the first I of selfishness, is increase. The second I is to impress, right? Fake it till you make it. Impress others. Post this. Don't post that. Redo this. Change that. We live in a culture of image and a culture of celebrity where everyone's a celebrity, everybody's famous, everybody's got a plan, and I always have to impress you, and you have to impress me. The third I, you know what it is. Indulge. Indulge yourself. Indulge your feelings. Indulge your emotions. Indulge your sense of rights. It's all about you. It's all about me. It's all about feeling good. Do what you have to do. Go where you have to go. Experience what you have to experience. Put in your body whatever you want to put in your body. Whatever you have to do, that's going to make you happy and have feelings of pleasure, indulge yourself. So we live in this doom loop sense of temptation and cycle, don't we? Of increase and impress and indulge. Don't even rinse, just repeat. Increase, impress, indulge. And it's all around us. And to say that it doesn't affect you, you're probably not telling the truth. I would not be telling the truth. There's nothing wrong with goal setting. There's nothing wrong with acquiring goods or money. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with presenting yourself in a respectable way. There's nothing wrong with pleasure in its proper place, but when those things are out of control and we're addicted to these three I's and we think that's where we're going to find the love, that's where we're going to fill that void in our soul and our life, then we end up becoming incredibly distracted and many times empty. And as it plays out, it can even lead to a form of despair. Selfishness, modified or full-blown narcissism, right? It lies at the center of our culture, and many times we're just drawn into it, and it lies at the core of who we are. It can become, it's dangerous. That's the diagnosis, right? That's where all the heroes have gone in our society today. The heroes are not heroes, but they're influencers, right? What do? We don't want to fall into that. And it's easy to judge people who, maybe have more than you have or look better than you. Well, it's easy to judge other people. We all deal with it. We all deal with it. We're all trying to keep up with the Kardashians on some level. So let's get some freedom here. Let's see what God has to say to us on this rainy, but it looks like the sun's come out, Mother's Day. Look at this one verse. Romans 12:1 says this. He says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, pleasing to God. This is your true and proper form of worship. Now, we're going to come back to that verse later on, but hold on to it. Because many times, life and truth comes to us in the form of paradox. Many times, truth and the real way to find life for you and for me is counterintuitive. What does God's word say? What should be the center of your life and my life if we say, listen, I want to follow God and his ways. I want to follow God in my family. I want to follow God in my relationships. I want to follow God at work and at school. I want to follow God. And yet I want to push back against this selfishness. Right here, his word calls us to what? Here's the paradox, to be a living sacrifice. So if selfishness lies at the center of our culture, sacrifice lies at the center of Christianity and must lie at the center of our life if we are to live the good life that God has called us to live. Napoleon Hill said this. He said, great achievement is usually born of great sacrifice, and it's never the result of selfishness. As you look throughout the pages of Scripture, what do we see? We see Noah just saying no to the haters and the shamers on social media and building a big old boat. Jumps in it, risks his family life in order to save civilization. Why did he do that? Sacrifice. It was a living sacrifice. God said, hey, Abraham, I want you to move away from your homeland. Move out of your comfort zone. Abraham left. Why? Because of sacrifice. Moses had the money, the prestige, the heritage in Egypt, but God called him to identify with his people who were in slavery to set them free, and he chose to do that. Why? Sacrifice. Mary, the mother of Christ, was willing to endure social stigma and ostracization, hid those things in her heart that she knew were true, but she did that. Why? Sacrifice. Sacrifice. Think about the symbols of the great world religions. Judaism, the symbol is a star, the Star of David. Islam, the symbol is a star and a crescent moon. The Eastern religions, the star is the balance of opposites, the yin and the yang. But Christianity, our symbol, and what lies at the very center of our faith is the cross. It's sacrifice. Our rituals that we have, that we follow, our initiation, which is baptism, we saw that by immersion. You're immersing yourself in the sacrifice, the death of Christ, and identifying with his death, coming out of the water and identifying with his resurrection. The meal that we had, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper that we ate, the blood and the bread symbolizes the broken body, the blood, the sacrifice of Christ. Sacrifice lies at the very center of the Christian faith. Memorial Day is approaching. We remember those who died for our country. Sacrifice. Mother's Day. Moms who carried us for 9 months and bathed us and fed us and stayed up late nights. My poor mom had 3 boys and a husband. 50-something years. Why she do that? Why do moms do that? Sacrifice. It's all about sacrifice. It's not about selfishness. It's about sacrifice. God calls us to a life of sacrifice, to become a living sacrifice. Sacrifices are usually dead, right? Even on a pedestrian level, if I hit a pop fly and it goes in the outfield, it's a sacrifice fly. I'm still out. We're kind of called to be a living out. Crazy. Living sacrifice. Men and women, young people who see their life as a means of giving away. Their life as sacrificing for someone else, laying down your life for something else. To sacrifice means to give something up for another. It means to suffer something for a higher cause and a higher purpose. If you want to find your life, lose it. If you want to live, die to your selfishness. If you want to be first, be last. Sacrifice lies at the center of our faith, and God calls us to make sacrifice the center of our life as well. A living sacrifice. Sacrifice is never easy. Sacrifice is tough. Sacrifice is doing many times those hidden, unknown things that people don't see. Sacrifice, like good farming, takes time and patience, blood, sweat, and tears. sacrifice. Living sacrifice. And sacrifice is often confused. That's what's interesting. Let's say you go, wow, I kind of get it, right? Like, God is great and he has sacrificed his own son for me, and I'm going to go live a life of sacrifice for others. And it's easy sometimes to kind of get into this idea that sacrifice is kind of a type of quid pro quo, right? And quid pro quo is simply a Latin phrase that means I do this for you and you do this for me. All of politics is quid pro quo, okay? A lot of life is quid pro quo. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. That's quid pro quo. So it's easy to kind of fall into the trap that sacrifice is a type of quid pro quo. If I sacrifice my life for God, if I sacrifice my life for others, then in return, I'm going to get some appreciation, right? Maybe, maybe not. But if your motive is appreciation to give something in order to get, then you're not really living a sacrificial life the way God has mapped out in this verse, in this passage. And when you don't get the love, right, you get kind of angry. I get kind of angry. And anger can lead to bitterness, and bitterness can lead to the poison of resentment. So, sacrifice, when God calls us to be a living sacrifice, many times this can be confused to be a quid pro quo. Also, becoming a living sacrifice, learning to sacrifice for others, it can kind of morph into a type of codependency. Since we're talking about the 80s here a little bit today, that was kind of an 80s buzzword. And what does it mean? To be codependent means that you are seeking to live someone else's life for them. You allow their emotions, their actions to control your life. And you think by rescue them and bailing them out again and again and again, that eventually they're going to get things, right in line. And a codependency is rooted in fear and guilt and shame. It's taking responsibility for someone else's emotions, actions, and their very lives. And it's easy to think, wow, well, I'm laying down my life just like Jesus did. No, you're probably not. You're probably simply encouraging them to continue in a behavior that's going to be destructive to them and those around them. So sacrifice and living a life, a living sacrifice, is not easy. And there are nuances and there are curves and there are twists and there are turns as we seek to live a life of true sacrifice. And that's why we have to keep coming back again and again and again to the gospel. The gospel, the good news, has to be the motivating force of how we live our life. If we want to live a life of sacrifice, to become a living sacrifice, to say no, to push back against this culture of selfishness, these three I's of increase, impress, indulge, oh my, if we want to push back against that, then the gospel must motivate us. Let's look back at Romans 12:1. I urge you in view of God's mercies to offer your body as a living sacrifice. So it's all in view of the sacrifice that God has given to us and for us in the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We sacrifice because he sacrificed. We sacrifice not in order to be accepted by God, to hope that he will forgive us. If I can just keep sacrificing, then maybe God will accept me. No, the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, is done. It is finished. We can't add to it. We can't subtract from it. It is finished. It's finished. So we can rest on one hand in the sacrifice of Christ, rest that we're forgiven, Rest that his works has saved us and made us right before God, that we are loved unconditionally in Christ, we can rest. We rest in the ultimate sacrifice. We rest in the fact that God has provided an heroic breakthrough in the life, death, and resurrection of his Son. We rest in his sacrifice. And that gives us peace. And that gives us joy. And that gives us gratitude to him and to Christ. And then out of that, we sacrifice. Out of that freedom, God freely chose to love us. Christ freely laid down his life for us. And then now we freely, not under compulsion, not under quid pro quo, we freely lay down our life for others. For others. God calls us to live that kind of life, not in order to be saved, but because we are saved. Not in order to be justified, but because we already are justified. We love freely. We sacrifice freely. And there's so many ways that we can do that. And we start to begin to say, God, I want to be a living sacrifice for you. I want to be a living sacrifice in my family, or I want to be a living sacrifice at work, or I want to be a living sacrifice at church. I want to pour myself out and give myself to others. God begins to use you and will use you in so many different ways. A couple nights ago, I had an interesting dream. Most of my dreams are not very interesting. They're just weird, okay? They're just a little bit weird. My dreams are weird. They're not spiritual. They're not Joseph and the coat of many colors and the cows and the sheep and all. I don't have that kind of dreams. I don't. But I kind of had a dream kind of like that. It was kind of cool. So let me tell you, I got to give you some background first before I get into the dream. So when I was born in a town called Waynesville, North Carolina. Party on, Waynesville. I was born in, this is an 80s, isn't it? Waynesville, because we were living in Canton, and Canton was so small, it didn't have a hospital, so they had to drive to Waynesville. That's where I was born. Now, my older brother Ed was already alive. He was 2 years older than me. He was born in the big town of Raleigh, North Carolina, okay? So we grew up in our early years in the Carolinas, in the mountains of North Carolina. Our grandparents lived in Mississippi, so we didn't see our grandparents much. This is before people actually flew and did that. So we didn't see our grandparents much. But down the hill from where we lived, okay, was this couple, an elderly couple who were a member of our church, and their name was Betty and Wesley, and we called them Aunt Betty and Uncle Wesley, though she was not my aunt or he was not my uncle. And they served kind of like our grandparents, though they weren't our grandparents. I know, it's strange. But they were an elderly couple. They'd never had any children, and for some reason, they adopted these crazy little boys, Ed and Ben, and eventually, in time, this Cliff as well. So even when we moved cities, when we moved from North Carolina to South Carolina, and South Carolina we moved from one city to the next, they would go and follow us. Sometimes we would go and stay in their home in the summers. Even when we moved to the great state of Texas and to Houston, they would still come out and visit us. In many ways, I can say we were closer to them than we were my blood grandparents. And they were so incredibly sacrificial to my brothers and I. They spent time with us. They played with us in their backyard. They gave us Christmas gifts and birthday gifts and attended our things growing up. And, they cooked these great Southern meals and made 7-Up floats with ice cream and just all these things that were amazing. And He fought in World War II, and he gave us some of his memorabilia. They just sacrificially poured out their life. And 2 nights ago, I had this dream. And in the dream, I saw Aunt Betty, right? It wasn't my aunt, but like my grandmother who I was talking about. And in the dream, I just hugged her in this dream. I'd not thought about her in years, but I just hugged her and said, Aunt Betty, thank you so much for being there. Thank you so much for loving me and my brothers. Thank you so much for serving as our grandmom, in a sense, when they were so many miles away. There's so many people in our lives that we can touch, that we can make a difference in, just like my Aunt Betty made in my life and my brother's life, by living a life, a free life of sacrificial love, fueled by the gospel, the grace, the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So where have all the heroes gone? They haven't gone anywhere. They're seated right here, right now.